At the beginning of 1942, the prices were 13% higher than they were in 1939. So, in order to combat inflation, the government froze retail prices on almost every item that you would shop for. It would be no higher price than it was in March of that year, and that price would stay the same throughout the war. And at the same time, the government put a ceiling on Port Huron rents, and there again the rentals would be held at the March 1st level. This news article says Port Huron and St. Clair County tenants will pay no more rent for the duration of the war than they did on March 1st, 1942. This ruling affects nearly half of Port Huron's families and a third of those in the county outside. Others own their own homes. As if overseeing price controls weren't enough of a job, the Federal Office of Price Administration, or OPA, also presided over the bigger job of rationing. The OPA set up complicated rules for rationing everything from beef to bubblegum and from sugar to shoes. In the process, the office became everyone's favorite wartime scapegoat. Despite the complexity and grumbling, most Americans grudgingly admitted rationing was a necessary part of the war effort. Rationing is where the fun begins. The person who did the grocery shopping had to be a tremendous organizer, and it would be very helpful if that person was also a mathematician. And you'll see what I mean in a few minutes. The mechanics of rationing programs changed over time but remains replete with red tape, including coupons, certificates, stamps, stickers, and a changing point system. Sugar was the very first item rationed nationwide in May of 1942. Every man, woman, and child in Port Huron, as well as the entire United States, would get a ration card May 4th through the 7th at their nearest school to permit him to buy half a pound of sugar a week. But the first thing you had to do was fill out this application for sugar rationing. And you had to fill out one of these for each person in your family. Now here's where the kicker comes in. There's also a place on this application for you to take inventory of how much sugar you have in your home right now before you get a ration book. So say you look in your pantry and you have 4 pounds of sugar, and they're going to give you 4 stamps for 4 pounds of sugar in your ration book. Well, in that case, you don't get any stamps because you already got 4 pounds. And to be honest, when they first heard that sugar is going to be rationed, people hoarded it. Now everybody was on the honor system, so who knows if anybody ever checked on it. This was in the Times-Herald, and the Times-Herald did a great job of informing the people of the rationing guidelines, when it was for, and how much it was for, and so forth, because it changed all the time. There were 4 wartime ration books, and this was War Ration Book number 1. And I use the word book loosely because what it really was a piece of cardboard that you folded up and folded over so that you opened it up and the stamps would be available. In the front part of the book, you had all the personal information about yourself. And then the second part is where they had the stamps. This ration book was the least complicated book of the bunch, but you still had to understand what was going on with it. You had to pay attention, otherwise you'd lose out on sugar. Initially, this book was used to ration sugar. Coupons were later designated for other products such as coffee. Stamps number 1 through 4 was designated for sugar. Each stamp was worth 1 pound of sugar and was given a designed 2-week period during which it must be used. Stamps 5 and 6 were for 2 pounds of sugar each and valid for a 4-week period. Stamp number 7 was a consumer bonus of 2 pounds of sugar for use between July 10th and August 22nd. Stamp 13 was for 5 pounds of sugar for 2 2/3 months expiring on August 15th. Stamps number 14 were 5 pounds of sugar for 2.5 months, August 16th to November 1st. And stamps 15 to 16 validated for 5 pounds of sugar each for home canning. Stamp 17 you couldn't use for sugar. That was designated for a pair of shoes. Stamp 18, you could use 1 pair of shoes between June 16th and October 31st. Stamps 19 to 28 was designated as coffee stamps, valid for 1 pound of coffee each for 5 weeks. You get an idea, even though the Times-Herald went to great lengths to explain everything, it was still pretty complicated, and this was the easiest book. They took a survey and found out that the women who mostly did the shopping, only about 75% of them understood how this program worked, and only about 55% of the men understood. So it took a while to get used to how all this stuff worked, and it only got worse from here. In the spring of 1943, more items were being rationed, including meat, dairy, and processed food or canned foods, which meant that it was time to register for ration book number 2. And this registration form was printed in the Times-Herald February 7, 1943. And if you look closely, you see once again we had to take complete inventory, not only of our sugar this time, but several other things. These are what you had to take inventory of. Coffee. They want to know how many pounds of coffee you owned on November 28, 1942. Keep in mind this registration is February of 1943. You also had to include your canned vegetables, including spices, canned fruit, vegetable juices, canned soup, chili sauce, ketchup. And you need to know the number of cans, bottles, and jars, 8-ounce size or larger, of commercially packed fruits, vegetable juices, and soups, chili sauce, ketchup owned on February 21st, 1943. I'm sure the government was depending upon patriotism to tell the truth in this matter. I'm not sure how many people did, however. If you look at the very top of this registration form, you see it says Point Ration Form. So this is completely new. This is like nothing they've had before. Ration book number 2 contained 2 different colors of stamps. The blue stamps were for processed goods, or in other words, canned foods, and the red stamps for meat, fish, and dairy products. Each person started with 48 blue points and 64 red points each month. So a family of 4 had a total of 192 points for processed food and 256 points for meats, fish, and dairy products. Each month brought new ration stamps as the old ones expired. Each stamp had a number on it designated the points it was worth and a letter showing which rationing period the stamp could be used. Each ration product had a point value that was independent of the price. The point value could fluctuate depending on scarcity, and grocers were required to keep current official points lists posted. A scarce can of beans might have a point value of 14, while a more plentiful can of corn might have a value of 8. At the checkout counter, the shopper was to remove the proper amount of stamps in the presence of the clerk. And to top it all off, grocers could not make change, so shoppers were advised to use high point stamps first if you can. So if you only had a can of fruit, say, that was worth 4 points, but you only had an 8-point stamp left, if you used it, you're going to lose 4 points because they weren't going to give you any points back for it. That's why they wanted to use the high points first. And of course the Times-Herald did their very best to try to explain it to people. The Times-Herald also posted rationing deadlines, so they give you the last date. You could use, stamp number 27 or stamp 6 and what it was to make sure people didn't lose out on what they're supposed to get. And the grocers did their part too when they ran ads in the Times-Herald. For example, looking at this ad here, they gave you the size of the can, they gave you the price, and they gave you how many points. So, for example, on the green beans on the first line, it was a number 2 can. That's the size. The price was 2 for a quarter, and the points was 14. And they also reminded you up at the very top when your stamps were good for. A, B, and C, one date. D, E, and F, another date. Now, if you were a single or a newly married couple, I think you could probably figure everything out without getting a migraine headache. But in our family, there were 7 people. So when my mom did grocery shopping, she had 7 ration books. And then you had to multiply all these points times 7. Now you can say, boy, that's a lot of points. You're well off. No, we had 7 mouths to feed, so we were no better off than the person that just had, one ration book for themselves. But it was much more difficult planning the meals. Not only that, the point system wasn't constant. For example, you could figure out your list and get ready to go grocery shopping the next day, and all of a sudden, in the Times Herald, you see the point system has changed. You go to the grocery store and they had to post all the points, and you see, oh, wait a minute, that wasn't what it was last week. It's changed again, and that kind of messes up your whole grocery list. And you thought today's shopping in grocery stores was hard. It was nothing compared to back then. There were 4 war ration books issued during World War II. We've already looked at 2 of them. Book number 3 was issued a little later, and this book was basically to replace book number 2. And for that reason, for some reason, the books were mailed to the people rather than issued at the schoolhouse. And once again, the Times Herald tried to explain the differences between the 2 books. And this book had a little different type of stamp on it. Actually, it had 2 different types of stamps. The first stamp was a little more patriotic. Each of the stamps, there was 4 in a series, had a military picture on it. One of them was an artillery picture, another was a tank, another was an aircraft carrier, and of course the airplane was the last one. They also had the same type of stamps, the point stamps that they had in book number 3, so they were still on the point system for some things. The military stamps with the pictures on it were used for things like coffee and sugar and shoes, and the other ones were used for the canned goods and so forth, just like they were in book number 2. Here's an actual photo that I found on eBay of a Type 3 ration book and the military stamps that are still in the book. Here's a little bit of a look at one of the stamps. In the Times Herald on the front page, October 27, 1943, ration book number 4 was issued, and it was back at the schoolhouses to pick them up. Book number 4 had red, green, and blue stamps. They still had the military stamps, but they had 3 new stamps. They were called patriotic stamps. The blue ones were a shaft of wheat. And the red ones were the horn of plenty. And then the green was the arm of liberty, or the Statue of Liberty's arm. Then, of course, you had several that were spares that could be used for anything. Later on during the war, when pork became more available, you could get 5 pounds of pork with one of those spare ones. Book 4 had something that none of the other books had in it, and they should have had in it, because the people were being hurt by it. And that is these little blue and red cardboard circles. They were called tokens, and they were a way to make change. Remember when I said if you had a can of corn that was worth 4 points, but you only had an 8-point stamp, you lost 4 points. They wouldn't give you any change back. But now with these tokens, they would. The grocers had the tokens and you had tokens. So now if you gave them an 8-point stamp, they would give you 4 tokens back. Or you could use your own tokens and just give them 4 tokens. and the blue was for the blue stamps and the red was for the red stamps. Now when the A&P ran an ad and they gave you the food ration calendar and told you what the stamps were and when you could use them and so forth, they also said red and blue tokens are used for change and worth 1 point each. Use red tokens with your red stamps, use blue tokens with your blue stamps. So that solved one of the problems that people had with the point program. There were many other things that were rationed. Too many for me to go into, but let me just cover a couple of them. They stopped making large appliances during the war. So if you had a stove that went out on you, you got it fixed, and it was absolutely unfixable, then you went to the ration board and got a certificate of approval to purchase another one. And that's what this form here is. Small appliances weren't made during the war either. If you had a toaster that went on the blink, you had to have it repaired. Of course, there was always Detroit Edison. Remember when they used to give you light bulbs for nothing and do repairs for you? Well, they really did repairs during that time period. And not only that, if you looked at the want ads, right across the top of the want ads, it said this: men trained and experienced to repair your appliances are listed under Class 68. And there were a lot of them. Typewriters is an item you wouldn't think would be rationed during the war, but it was rationed for a couple reasons. Number one, there was a metal shortage and they stopped producing them during the war. And number two, even before the war, the demand was greater than the supply. Not only did typewriters contain metal, but they were vital to a paperwork-dependent military. In July of 1942, a call went out to the public to donate late-model, non-essential typewriters to the military. Typewriters were rationed in the U.S. from March of 42 to April of 44, requiring a certificate from the local ration board for a purchase. 1944, McTaggart Hoffman run this ad: "We've got typewriters. Well, things are looking up." Well, just go down a little bit further and they're not looking up. You rent the typewriter, not buy the typewriter. In 1945, this editorial appeared in the Times Herald. Is the Army hogging supplies? The Army bought at least 500 additional typewriters for its Pacific Force. They were no sooner delivered than the Pacific War came to an end, and the Pacific Force was dissolved. Yet it hangs on to these typewriters while civilian users cannot buy typewriters at any price and will probably cling to them until the urgent need for them in civilian business has passed. It would be interesting to know how many other things badly needed by civilians are being kept in storage by the military authorities, who seem to loathe to release anything. Later in 1945, typewriters were no longer rationed, and Kerr Albert run this little blurb: "Typewriters released. Place your order for a typewriter with Kerrs. No priority necessary." The sooner you place your order, the sooner you get your typewriter. This concludes part 2 of our series. Join me in part 3 and we'll look at the effect the black market had on rationing. We'll also see how folks overcame the lack and availability of fresh vegetables.